Hi there. Welcome to the Island Treasures mini podcast for caregivers. I'm your host and caregiving consultant, Allison Van Schie of Alongside Caregiver Consulting from the Comox Valley on beautiful Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. When is it the right time for your loved one to enter a care home? This is likely the hardest decision family caregivers have to make for a spouse, a parent, or a sibling, especially if we've made the promise never to put them into a care home. At the time the promise was made, things were manageable. Perhaps there weren't any hints that our loved one would one day need any amount of supportive care. But circumstances change, and his or her care needs have increased. You find you are doing more and more to help them with their activities of daily living, their ADLs. You're taking on more responsibilities, being responsible for them. Add to that, you are now solely responsible for the household, the finances, basically everything. And you are the only one who can make the decisions, all the decisions. Even with extra support and outside help, you recognize caregiving for your loved one at home is no longer manageable. You are at your breaking point. And deep down, you know you can no longer keep them at home. And you realize you are going to have to break that promise you made before you break. It's no longer safe for them to be cared for at home or to age in place as they had hoped they could. Even if you didn't promise never to put them into a care home, there may come the time you have to make the most difficult decision that none of us ever want to make, when our best intentions are defeated by reality. I'd like to play a brief excerpt from one of the earliest podcast episodes from season 1 of the Island Treasures podcast, featuring Dennis Dulniak. Take a listen.
But it got to the point where the difficulty of her living at home with me became way too challenging and stressful. And the most difficult decision to be made was placing her into a memory care community. And that decision that people need to make of placing their loved one is a very, very hard one. As I say, it was the hardest decision I had to make in our marriage.
The lucky caregivers have loved ones who adapt easily to living in a care home. But even these caregivers admit it was the hardest decision they had to make in their relationship. And yet, there is another statement that I hear from caregivers once they have made that most difficult decision, and that is, I wish I'd done it sooner. They recognize their loved one's care needs, safety needs, and physical needs are being met. And over time, as they settle into their care home, their social and spiritual needs are also fulfilled. So how exactly do you make this hardest decision? For this exercise, I will encourage you to write down your answers. Let's start by identifying what your tipping point is. What do you see as being the one thing that pushes you over the edge? Or perhaps it's a combination of things. Are you there already? Doing this exercise may feel like it's the last thing you want to do right now, as it can be very emotional and a little time-consuming, but it can help. Consider which caregiving scenarios over the last few days or weeks have been the most challenging for you. Be honest. How many times did they happen? Write down even if it only happened once. What aren't you saying out loud? Write it down. The next part of this exercise is to rank these challenges. By looking at the worst experience you encountered, decide how many times it would need to happen within a given time frame for you to reach your limit. Once or twice within a day, a week, month? Consider this question for each of the experiences that you listed. Have you reached your tipping point already? Have you surpassed this limit? It's not healthy for you if you have. And that's not healthy for your care recipient either. Your loved one can pick up on your anxiety and anxiousness about the whole situation. Take a few moments to reflect on your answers and how they have been impacting you and your loved one. Next, we're going to talk about guilt, the guilt that's associated with making this and other decisions. For many of the ideas I present here, I'm referring to a helpful resource called Nursing Homes and Assisted Living, the Family's Guide to Making Decisions and Getting Good Care. It's the second edition. And it's written by Peter S. Silin and published in 2009. Incidentally, Peter was a mentor of mine. From pages 58 and 59, he says, "Guilt is like a little voice in our heads. It tells us how we should act and behave and criticizes what we have done. It is the voice of standards that we have set for ourselves, or sometimes that we think society has set." Peter goes on to talk about our own fears, fearing what other people may be thinking about us or what we think they're thinking about us, believing they are criticizing us for putting a family member into a care home. Let's explore more of Peter's insights from page 61 of his book, specifically about making the decision for our spouse's future care needs. Did your wedding vows include, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part? If so, you're likely chastising yourself for even considering putting them into care. Would you agree that you're feeling guilty? Remember, this isn't something you want to do. Let's think of it this way. What if your spouse had a terminal disease that required hospitalization for the rest of his or her life? Would you then be able to keep them at home or want to keep them at home? Placing a loved one into care so that their care needs are met means you are choosing care for them. You are not abandoning them, and you're not a bad person. You may feel that you are choosing yourself over them, and internally, you're labeling yourself as selfish, which Peter says is a word dripping with judgment. Yet, according to Psychology Today, there are 3 types of selfish: the good, the bad, and the neutral. Incidentally, by the time you are seeking placement for your loved one, you probably have been prioritizing them and their care needs for quite some time. That is not selfish, good, bad, or otherwise. Nowhere does it say that you need to exhaust yourself or impair your health in your role as spouse or caregiver. Peter talks about our need to ask for forgiveness, especially when someone is angry with us. When that person is our loved one who has dementia or a cognitive impairment, we may want them to understand the reasoning behind our actions or decisions, but it is best not to try to reason with them, as dementia impacts their executive functioning and their ability to reason is compromised. You may still want to soften your feelings of guilt by seeking forgiveness, their forgiveness. So instead, agree with your loved one, validate their feelings, tell them it is unfair. It's unfair for both of you. Then change the subject or drop it completely and stop talking. If you still feel you need forgiveness, share your feelings with a friend or confidant. If you've been keeping journals throughout your caregiving journey, and I hope you have, now is the time to reread them and remind yourself of where this journey has taken you and your loved one, and remind yourself of the prognosis of their progressive disease, their illness. Your journal will likely highlight the many losses you have already experienced, and you are grieving. Your relationship is changing, which means your roles are changing. What do you do for a friend who is grieving? Would you offer them sympathy and compassion? Of course you would. So it's okay and even helpful to offer yourself that same sympathy and compassion, and be kind to yourself as you are making the hardest decision for yourself and your loved one. There's so much more surrounding the processing of this decision and the heavy emotional components that accompany this life transition. But these points I share as a starting point to raise awareness of the need to be kind to yourself, to recognize your tipping point, and to recognize the need that trumps all needs, and that is for safety, both your care recipients and yours. If you need to talk about this decision, be sure to reach out to a trusted friend or counselor. And if you wish to contact Alongside Caregiver Consulting, there's a contact button on the Alongside Caregiver Consulting.ca website. And I will include the title for Peter Silin's book again in the notes. Thank you for tuning in today. Take care.